Hello, and welcome to my video on how I created my Southpaw Hotswappable Handwired keyboard. I first created my keyboard in Keyboard Layout Editor, and then took this design into Swill Plate and Case Builder. You could also use AI03 Plate Generator, which I also used to create the stab cutouts. I then took the plate design into Illustrator and used a library object to create the sockets for my hot swaps. These bits were designed just to drag and drop onto bits of the plate, and I'll include the files below. I really recommend doing some tests. I cut out some of the bits of acrylic from some offcuts just so I could see how everything fit together. I did plenty of testing. I found that because these were tiny bits with high tolerances, sometimes the bits didn't fit together as I wanted. So I did some tests with the stabilizers and many tests with the Kale switch holes. I also had a bit of trouble with making the stems fit neatly. Once I was happy with it all, I created every layer of my case in Illustrator. Now as the PCB, the open and the closed layers, the bottom layer and the top layer. With hand-wired keyboards, people tend to use plate stabilizers. I wanted to use screw-in stabilizers for the extra stability and had a bit of trouble finding measurements for it. In the end, I used KiCad to generate the holes and used those to create my own. Then it was time to do the cutting. I cut out just my PCB layer first so that I could wire it all up and then put it into a case. Once the PCB layer was all cut out, I tested each hot swap socket in the holes that I'd cut for them. I found that there was a big enough variation in perhaps the holes cut by the laser cutter or in fact the hot swap sockets themselves that some bits didn't fit exactly, so I made sure that they all fit, and if they didn't, I tried different sockets until they did. I then used one of my earlier tests to hold the sockets while I soldered on the diodes. Once I'd done all of the sockets, I stuck on the LED strip. I didn't record a lot of my soldering, it wasn't very interesting, but then I soldered up the rows and columns of my board. You can find a lot of information about this on the internet. I then stuck in my EMT linear switches so I could begin testing. It actually worked out pretty well, and I put on my old keycaps and actually was using it as a daily driver. This was a massive mistake because then disaster struck. Because it didn't have a case on it and I was typing on it as I normally would, I managed to short something. It was probably the LED strip and it killed the entire controller. Luckily, my whole lump of soldering pretty much came out in one lump. However, rather than simply resolder to a new controller, I decided to redo the entire thing with magnet wire. This was much thinner and more finicky, but it was much flatter as well, and generally looked a bit nicer. This time, apart from some testing, I didn't use the keyboard until I'd cut out the plate and all the other layers. The layers were made up of 3mm acrylic. The bottom layer was 1mm acrylic, which worked well because it had a bit of flex to it. Here you can see everything kind of squashed up inside. I then did a bit more testing, and most of my keys worked off the bat. Some of it just needed a bit more resoldering, but it all worked in the firmware side. There's a lot of information out there about how to make the firmware. I used a lot of the documentation and asked on the QMK Discord. Overall, I'm really happy with how it all turned out. Thank you for watching, and I'll include the files I used below.